concluded our session with a discussion of the sublime and tried to locate where we are as we engage in the traumatic strictures of learning. One word that might have helped us in some ways is one that's in current circulation, which is that of awe. As when you say, awesome, you're awesome. Or you have an experience of awe, which is an offshoot, I would think, of the sublime, which is very close to and can easily flip into awful, right? There's something awful. So there's a sense of a terroristic incursion, a shock, Erlebnis, an experience. But it's something that we affirm when we say, this is awesome. And perhaps it's not entirely a coincidence that it comes from, in terms of its currency and buoyancy, surfer culture, which, as you know, is linked to oceanic, the dynamics sublime in certain ways. So it's awesome. We might remember that we're awesome this morning and that we are here. And we're preparing to work together, which is perhaps awful in some ways, but in the sense that also integrates awe and awesomeness. So today we prepared a text by Derrida, and many of you have already been introduced to Derrida's works, but we can begin with beginner's awe, no matter what we do. Beginner's awe is not only a yogic instruction, but it's the properly, bless you, the properly, if we could have a sidebar, what kind of a performative or constitutive speech act is bless you? You know, are you wishing something? Are you conferring something? Do I have the authority to bless you at all? Am I speaking for the big A, ultra, other, when I say bless you? And so on and so forth. And I'd be happy to discuss with you what happened when I said to Derrida once, if I hear God bless America one more time, I'm going to puke. So we can discuss that moment where I was corrected. In the properly philosophical mood is in Greek tomazein, which means a state or stimul. Yesterday, are you ready to let go? Okay. There you are. Of awe, wonder, a little bit of bewilderment, astonishment, but it has to have a juste mesure, which is to say, if you're too astonished, the Greeks might think that you're an idiot. Like if everything is duh, or the opposite of duh. What's the opposite of duh? Huh? Right. Or well, I know what, wow. Or dude, you know, that kind of, if the duh was going out, stop in the middle. It's the opposite of duh. It's a certain measure, a proper measure, according to the Greeks, the early Greeks, of awe. Like, what is this? The wonder. This is the questioning stance of non-knowing, of originating the philosophical disposition, demeanor, state of something like mind. Mind is an 18th century contraption that we're still in some ways stuck in. In any case, awe. So we, every day, will begin with beginner's awe, or Thomasin, which is the philosophical greeting to things and being that suddenly are new or appear in their newness, are ungraspable, unseizable, inappropriable. If you appropriate things or classify them or think you know how to handle them, you've kind of drained them off of their vitality, you've killed them off, you've made them part of an already known grid or taxonomy, and you've put them on a map that is very limiting and restricting as far as the splendor and glamour of their being might be. So awe, which could flip into stupidity for the Greeks, like if you're always, what's that, what's that, what's that, and you don't have the right measure of stupor, then you're stupid, right? But you can be stupefied up to a limit. So let us try to retrieve that mood of awe, of Thomasin, of surprise, astonishment, fascination. But again, as Blanchot says, too much fascination means blindness. If you're fascinated by something or the other, you don't see it. You're just in this kind of transferential intoxication, which I welcome, by the way. But it means that you're not seeing or thinking, or you don't have. So everything, as Nietzsche said, everything is a matter of dosage. Everything is a matter of dosage. You have too much history, you're going to be crushed by its monumentality and weight. You have too much baggage. I don't even have to finish that, bless you. You have too little of something, too little brilliance before you, something wilts you, you devitalize. So we want to understand what Nietzsche meant by everything is a matter of dosage. And that's almost life's challenge to you, is to not necessarily, here we have an attack dose, right, of a certain kind of body of knowledge that's being stuffed down your throats, maybe, since we were throwing up yesterday, we can now see what made that happen, and so on and so forth. I'm talking dosage already because I thought that tomorrow maybe we should, or might want to, talk about the politics of intoxication, drugs and law. If you agree, that's what I thought we might work with tomorrow. A whole, which involves, by the way, aesthetics, because the word Rausch in German, what does that mean in English? Does anyone know?
Like a very excited intoxication.
Right, like you're blown away. By the way, the sublime is also an experience of being blown away. And it inches towards something like nuclear desire, because we have a vocabulary and rhetoric in our articulations of desire that often indicate a desire for decimation. I mean, how do we name moods or conditions of extreme appreciation or joy. Very often in a nuclear rhetoric, like it was a blast, something as it was a blast, or at least a technologically fragile state. Might not be so fragile because we've forgotten the origin, but it could be, he really turns me on. She really turns me on. That's a techno determination, right? So we want to be alert to that and aware of the way desire calls up and summons forth very destructive, explosive end zones of being. It's not have a nice text or have a nice feeling. It's, as we started to discuss yesterday, something that Kant discovered and had a radical insight into and then recoiled from. He beat a retreat from his own radical, terroristic insight. So today we begin with awe as we meet for the first time Derrida and say hello and welcome him and see how we have before us an example of the way he works. By the way, tomorrow, is tomorrow Wednesday? Yeah. So tomorrow, Anne Dufour-Montel will start off, and then we'll have with the 3 classes a jam session, as I announced yesterday. That is to say, Pierre Alferi, Anne, and me, and us, and we're going to beat them, right? We're going to work together. That usually is very invigorating and exhilarating, and then one is always happy to come home to our class and work again together. So Derrida goes after unimpeachable virtues, things that we think we appreciate, we value, and we know. And he looks at them closely, and as all close-ups in film and in person suggest, there's something always uncanny and even scary when you get up close and personal with something, right? So Derrida has gone after ideas or concepts or political habits or grammars that we think we can applaud and that we affirm and we don't think about very much. Now tell me if you know all this, or is this okay to go at this level and this speed? Yeah? Good. Thank you. So, for example, we would consider, or culturally, when I say we, that's already a problem, and Derrida has isolated it, and the presumption of saying we, as if we're a constituted community that agrees, that doesn't have all sorts of minority reports, dissidence, difference, internal alterity and disabling mechanisms. But so that I can finish one sentence, I won't deconstruct everything, though I am certainly capable and wishing to do so. But so I fakely, with 5 million quotation marks, say we. But now I've forgotten. Okay, we tend to think that something like brotherhood is a good thing, for instance. And Derrida goes after it in another text, which is rich with political significance, because he reminds us that in France, the political and historical and liberatory slogan is what? Right, fraternité. He goes, okay, liberté, we'll take care of that later. Égalité, maybe. Wait a minute, fraternité? Well, all you have to do is say fraternity in English, and the shit starts hitting the fan, right? So Derrida, first of all, he has that aha moment of saying, whoa. And by the way, de Man has taught us in one of his essays to be very careful of any, Paul de Man, of any enumeration or any list, and find out, are these values made of equivalency? Because that's always the suggestion when a list is brought out, right? Or an act of enumeration. Baudelaire does this, others, everyone does it. Everyone says this, 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 and this. But from now on, you should have a red alert and say, really? Let me look at this. What's the relation to this one, and that one, and that one? Are these terms that can cohabit? What kind of a community of terms are involved? Does this enumeration, is it faking something or pulling one over on me? John?
Just a small observation. We've been getting a whole lot of lists this past week from you, from Tom Summer, where lists of how terms are defined and redefined, and
okay.
Etymologies and philologies and all that kind of stuff.
Right. Do you remember which list you're referring to that I offered?
It's a list of, gosh, if I could remember exactly, but it comes off all the time, where you say awe, awful, awe,
right.
Right?
That's right.
And
so if we, one part of a true pedagogy would be to go so slowly that everything would be interrogated, and you're quite right to bring that up, because what about awful and awesome? What is the aberrant and disjunctive moment where it's not the same? Or it's the same but not identical? That's very important in critical theory, is to make that distinction. Something can be the same, of the same order, but it's not identical. So you're absolutely right, that very often that's a catachrestic moment in teaching. Remember yesterday we discussed catachresis, which is to say an error, but it might be a willed error or a blind error. So thank you for bringing that up. So every time you see an enumeration or list, ask what the milieu of each term is, and are they really to be put in a list? Because de Man will always be able to tag out one of the terms in a list and show how it subverts the whole argument. Okay, so that's always very important. But in any case, here we want to apply it to freedom, liberté, égalité, and then fraternité. So Derrida says, okay, we can analyze why there are three things. There's lots of build-up metaphysically and philosophically and historically, traditionally, theologically, for a triadic structure. But what are the relations of these terms among themselves, and why must it be brotherhood? And by including and asserting fraternité, what is the implicit or explicit exclusionary operation here? What does it mean to say fraternité?
What about the sister?
Right, that's Derrida's question. Who gets squeezed out, who gets crowded out, or forgotten or repressed? Now, in many, many cultures, a brother is considered something to be affirmed, right? You're a brother, or bro, again, from surfer culture, and so on and so forth. So this seems to be a virtuous tag or signifier, and Derrida gets in there. And by just pulling a little on this one term, makes all of democracy start trembling like the Eiffel Tower. Have any of you seen the Eiffel Tower lately? It has a way of shimmering. And all of democracy starts shimmering like that because fraternité evermore becomes a sore thumb that's sticking out and raising more question than it answers or deals with or could possibly cope with. Yes?
Wouldn't, I mean, I don't know the piece, so wouldn't it be easy for someone to say it's gender neutral, like brotherhood of man? Like I'm not saying that, but I'm wondering, does he actually construct the notion of brotherhood along in similar veins as he would with neighbor or hospitality, like that? He could be my enemy as much as he could be my friend, kind of thing. Like I was wondering what he does.
Not understanding the question, but he will, Derrida offers us a structure that is neither nor, it's not neither nor or either or, but it's both and. So it will be both gender neutral and it's still quand même fraternité. Can we talk honestly? You know, are you really going to gender neutralize brotherhood? Okay, you could. There are compelling reasons to do so, but it's also about a guy thing, right?
But it also excludes some men. It doesn't just exclude
Absolutely, absolutely, very
you have
good.
to be a brother.
Very true. And that's where he wants you to consider all of the implications that an utterance that becomes a national slogan and motto that is meant to indicate inclusion actually operates exclusions that are pernicious and unavoidable and even involves men. That makes me think of a moment in Woody Allen where he says, listen, I also suffer from penis envy. It's not only for women. Marcus, I know it's...
Just to respond to this question, where he makes this philosophical move is in a book called Politics of Friendship, and the discussion begins with like, well, what is the true distinction
That's why I was wondering if you
between friendship and politics? And I would encourage you to take a look at it.
That's what I thought it was. That's why I brought up independent. That's what I was wondering about.
It's really, really tremendous.
So, that's one example of Derrida going after something that offers itself up and has been received as a positive thing. And he'll put a checkpoint on it, which frustrates and annoys a lot of people who are maybe intellectually a little lazy, you know, or want to hang out in certain precincts and not really have to deal with the shit of reconfiguring and deconstructing all of democracy because one word sticks out like a sore thumb or is a thorn in our collective thigh. And that's all it takes. He goes there and he goes, first of all, as we said yesterday, the structure is to say, okay, let's put a red flag on fraternité. What's that doing there? What's the relation to freedom and the other thing, equality? Okay, that looks wrong. But first he says why it's right. What necessitated and motivated this? So he's not just going to jump on it and say, I'm tagging this out. Someone pulled a fast one. No, first he'll say why it's right, why it had to be there. And that's very much a rigorous engagement. If you can find, let's say, an error. Now here's an important distinction that Paul de Man makes that you may want to use in your works between mistake and error. A mistake is like a glitch or a little fuck up or uh-oh. But an error, which he takes from the great poet Hölderlin, is an exemplary error. It had to be made to get where you're going. You had to fall into this zone of wrongful movement, thought, a false light was put on it. So an error isn't just a mistake, it's exemplary and it's teaching. And it's, as traumatic as it might be, it was necessary and necessitated by the system that was pushing you forward. It pushed you toward a place of error and blindness and forgetting, so that some work could be done there. So this would be Derrida's first move, or second move, first to locate or identify a problem zone or area, then to say why it has to be there, and how it rhymes with all of metaphysics and historical traditionalist narrative and masculinist ideology and so on and so forth. And then only can you permit yourself to go after it and take it down. Or, for Derrida, it's not that violent. All that deconstruction needs is a little shift. It's practically Tai Chi. You know Tai Chi, where you don't, in a Western way, go right, punching it out, duking it out with an adversary or enemy, as Rahel reminded us of in this context, but you step aside and let the enemy force collapse on its own force. So Derrida actually makes micrological interventions. He goes after something that is not okay, but it's not, of course it takes the whole house down, but he doesn't start with a massive nihilistic bounce or tremendous a whole armament or troops and tropes that just overwhelm the enemy target. Instead, he goes in there and he quietly, so if we could have decibels in art, that's why I like to start with a blast, because if we could have decibels in our texts or relation to texts, you would put Derrida on pianissimo. He quietly says, and calmly, what's fraternity doing there, please?
I was thinking of that when you said Rauschen.
Yes.
Because it's the wind is doing this. It's a very soft, and then to translate it in English into blast, for me it's the opposite.
Right, so it was Rausch, and Rauschen, and then Rauschen. These are related but different. Rauschen is noise, you're absolutely right, and the Romantics had a sense of the Urgeräusch, zum Beispiel, which is responsible for all sorts of things. That would be the primal sound or primal noise. So there is a relationship, but it's not the identical word. Rausch is intoxication. Ernst Jünger said, the Americans ruin everything. Why the word, the heavy-booted word intoxication? It has toxic in it. It's instead of getting high and, you know, all the happy ways of naming intoxication, leave it to the English and the Anglo-Americans to find something that immediately puts the whole accent on the toxic. You know, or I was smashed, or blotto. And I mean, just think of the terms that refuse a certain pleasure and jouissance. Jouissance is something else. Let's just say pleasure and joy. So Rausch is what are other words for intoxication?
It's alpha.
But in English.
Wasted?
Getting wasted. Yeah, getting wasted.
Or fucked up.
Yes. So you're right that there's a relation to sound and sonic kind of buzz. That's where I would, okay, the translation would be a buzz. You know how some people are buzz killers? A buzz is a sound, right? And when you have a buzz, it's after you've had a few beers, right? It's all a matter of dosage. You don't have a buzz when you're wasted. So there are gradations and scales. So you're right, thank you. That's how I would locate it in English, a buzz. Which means it's buzzing, kind of. Well, I think that's what it means. So brotherhood. The other thing would be the virtue of hospitality, which was mentioned. excuse me? Which Anne has brought to the English language and translated and published in her discussions with Derrida on hospitality. Now, hospitality seems to be a very virtuous thing, right? It's welcoming. Have you read on hospitality?
Yeah.
So maybe you don't need to have a quick review or... Okay,
Not
helps.
all of us, I mean, there's some of us, but not everyone.
All right, so Derrida goes for hospitality, and as we will see in forgiveness, he asks what would be unconditional hospitality, what would be conditional, and do we even know unconditional hospitality? Because there are few conditions to Kant's setting up the cosmopolitan virtue of hospitality. One is, for example, can I show you hospitality here? Not clear. I don't own this space. Do you have to be a property owner to be properly proprietous? You might. If I welcome you to my home, that means I need to have a home, right? You may not be able to show hospitality. I mean, a presupposition of hospitality may be ownership. This is something to bear in mind. You seem to be doubtful of this. Can you welcome someone to something that is not
You're welcome into your own space, wherever you are.
But
your
is
own
this our
space?
thing?
It's not, you're
Yeah, no, I mean,
expropriating.
literally, like, space meaning the time that you're giving, the attention that you're offering, the interrelatedness that you're sharing, that's what I meant.
Yeah, but then we might have to glide off hospitality proper.
Maybe
Maybe
for someone
you could
else.
say, I can help you. You could say, I'm gracious.
Friendly.
You could say, I'm warm. You could say all sorts of things, and I'm welcoming. However, strictly speaking,
Yeah.
can someone who isn't propertied, if you follow Kant's logic, can that person offer hospitality? This is a real question. Can someone who has been evicted, or who is a squatter, or who is living under conditions of political squalor and disgrace, or in a slum, and so on and so forth, and doesn't have a trace of ownership, is that person even in a position to offer hospitality? So this is a question that has to be faced and acknowledged. That doesn't mean that the people aren't absolutely generous, giving, lovely, loving. We're talking hospitality. What are the conditions for the possibility of offering hospitality? The other thing that Derrida points out, among many things, since you've read it, I don't have to review it with you, is the absolute model and immemorial paradigm and grid for the offering of hospitality, which is a violent model that we have inherited and repressed. Do you remember what that is? Does anyone remember?
Yes, hostess?
Yeah, I need a sentence.
Would you, I'm not very good at sentences, I guess. Hostess, the root for host and guest is the same root, xenos in Greek, and I think that, so I am not a philosopher like you, so I'm a poet. Hostess, I think, is the Latin term, which means enemy, and I think that they're linked. Could be wrong. Yes.
Very good.
Are they linked? There's a question.
Yeah, very good.
Very good.
And what's the paradigm, the grid, the model for all of the narratives and memories and grammar for hospitable offering? And this is something that has been repressed and forgotten. It's at the core of Derrida's reading, and it blows everything out of the water, because this is the model and origin of hospitality, which is...
I'm not sure if I have it right, but I mean, in his reading of the polis, you only have identity within the the city-state. So you have no identity, you have no language.
That's true. That's not the model or the grid, but it's absolutely true that usually when hospitality is extended, a few police actions are involved, like you know the name of the person you've invited. That's already a violence. It means it's not unconditional. Unconditional hospitality means my door is open, you do not have to identify yourself. You do not, I will not inspect your passport. There are no borders here. I don't need to know your name. I don't need to know your game. I don't need to know anything about you. It's unconditional. That rarely happens. So Derrida is showing us how we have never really trusted or entrusted to others or ourselves or ever known unconditional hospitality, which would also mean there's no time limit. You come to my home, you can set up shop, stay for 5 weeks, stay for 5 hours, doesn't matter. No. Hospitality, as we practice it, as you know, it's getting around midnight or 2 in the morning, or it depends what you're doing, what kind of drugs or other things you offer as part of the hospitality package. But there is a timer that's set and a metronome. There's certain expectations. All that means it's conditional. But the model, the primal pulse that teaches us and that we've repressed of hospitality is the hospitality that Lot has shown, which is to say that he welcomed strangers to his house and he offered his daughters for gang rape. That's hospitality. Let me explain. That hospitality was initiated on this narrative. And this is where Derrida is kind of Nietzschean, which is to say he's going to put out a genealogical probe and find out what the origin of what looks like a virtue is. And the story there is that when Lot welcomed the strangers to his house, he offered them everything. And you know, certain cultures still practice this. That part of the package deal of absolute hospitality is to offer the women of the house for the stranger, the visitor, the intruder, the guest, ghost, whoever arrives, to take possession of everything that's yours, including especially the daughters of the house or the wife. That is the model, half or altogether by us, repressed and forgotten. On that story, the entire edifice of hospitality is built. So Derrida reminds us that this virtue, like if you would start out this class, or if we would have a reset and restart, reboot, and I would say, isn't hospitality a kindly virtue? Does anyone oppose hospitality? No one would oppose it. Why would you oppose such a open-hearted, benign, benevolent, thank you, tradition or gesture? And Derrida then puts out a probe and goes to the origin of what generated all stories and all habits and all inscriptions, or what Nancy would call exscriptions, of hospitable behaviors among peoples. And this would be, in the Abrahamic tradition, the core story that is, as I said, repressed and forgotten because it's unbearable. Yet, now, okay, so we've established this. That sucks, a big one, right? But now Derrida is not done with his work. He has to show how that still permeates hospitality, how it's still part of the somewhat invisible package of hospitable opening. What are you opening? Whose legs or legacy are you opening when you offer hospitality? And what do we do about this? Okay, before I said, and this is a little dissociated from that demonstration, that Derrida performs micro-logical interventions. So just a little shift would change everything. He's not gunning for, though he might be. I mean, he might be on some level, but he proceeds in this way by reading where things derive their original pulse. And what do we do with that? I know you're horrified, you think it's not so cool after all. Now what do we do with that? We're left with something that is very unstable and inappropriable. No one wants it now. So now what do we do? You know, so I'm going to leave it at that question side. Yes.
So can we say that he's going after authority instead of power? Because yesterday you said power is the guns and tanks, but authority is very subtle, whispering. And when you say now Derrida goes for the small thing that shatters everything, is it authority he's after?
Well, we could make that transposition. That's a very excellent suture from yesterday. It wouldn't be an easy and smooth transition, but we absolutely could say that authority, that hospitality has authority.
Began with such a horrible thing.
And even now what you're saying, your intervention is very rich, because we would say, where's the power in here? Is it impotence or power to offer up your women to the stranger? And it would deconstruct a lot of our assumptions even about what power is. Yes?
Doesn't Lot offer up his daughters in substitution for the angels, not to the angels? So the people in the town he invites, or I can't recall it.
Okay, if you look at the text, now that's a very good nuance to see, is it already a substitution? But what the text will say of the Old Testament is that they were at it all night long. Okay? I mean, you're right to ask for a close reading, and it's scandalous that I'm not doing so. But the point was only meant to be a drive-by, and to say that something as benevolent and benign as hospitality rests on an impossible récit or narrative, something that we want to repel.
You know, it's funny that you say that it's so benevolent and benign. However, I feel like whenever I've been offered hospitality, there's always a certain suspicion, even as a child, because of the conditionality of it.
Thank you for bringing that up. I consider it utterly aggressive when someone invites me. Now you opened up a whole dossier of my, fucked up. You're absolutely right. Or I see that someone's going, when you're a child and someone's going like this for hours as oh, you're such a cute thing, and practically,
ripping your face off.
Yeah, ripping it on salt or something.
They're like molesting you.
Molesting you, exactly. So there's you're great. That was an amazing opening, because you're right. Once we start opening these dossiers, so that's how I wanted to start, so that we can go to forgiveness as well. We think, oh, it's like a David Lynch film, right? It all starts out with the frame of the robin singing and all that. And you know that this is suspicious, as you said, and pernicious. And there's been the Freudian incursion of what kind of aggression is being performed, what kind of invasion occurs on both levels. What does it mean to open your house to someone? Does it become a prison? Are you a ward? Once it's conditional, what are your responsibilities as a guest ghost? You have to you bring a present, you have to be polite, you have to enjoy the meal, you have to talk. You can't just, you can't just run straight for the couch and turn on the TV, unless, these are people you hang with.
I also think of, I was
I
in
love
India.
that.
I was in India though, and I was visiting a person's house. And literally I walked up on their porch, and I didn't know who the person was.
Right.
And they said, come on in, God is guest, which is a Hindi belief that
Right.
if you arrive, you are like an avatar. So the house is yours, and they don't bother you. Go about your business.
Right. I mean, the arrival of the stranger is always, and especially if the stranger, I'm not saying this about you, George, especially if the stranger is dressed in rags. That's the dress code of the sacred, right? So you have the run of the house. You come from an unknown, unidentified space, which means you're divine, you know? There's all sorts of permutations and facets once you open the docket of hospitality, to which we have culturally, until this moment, a pretty good relation to. Now, hospitality grows into all sorts of political implications. It's about, I mean, Derrida was very much an activist for the so-called illegal aliens, the undocumented and so on, and that France had to show, he felt, hospitality. And that's why he was motivated, I think, to go after hospitality too. Because what does it mean for these countries to close off the borders and not open up? And then, of course, he was going to show how hospitality was always kind of a fake and a substitute.
You were asking, so we've got this word that Derrida shifted a little bit, hospitality, and what do we do with it now? Nobody wants it. And before that, we were tying it to hospitality as property structure. You know, you have to own property to be able to do this, and lot with the property of his daughters. So I guess my question is...
See, this I just want to, if I may, excellent. The way you're building the question, you're saying, this is what was said, I'm linking it in this way. And now I would like to ask a question. That not only shows hospitality to the teaching and to everyone, it's a risk that you take of showing, have I understood correctly? And on this basis, I would like to make my intervention. Go ahead.
Okay. So
now he's going to decimate.
No, not at all. Okay. The question is, what do we do with this thing now?
Yes.
And I think there was some hesitation when you asked earlier about, does this necessarily have to be tied to owning a home or having property? And I think about something like, various sites of an Occupy movement, where there is mutual hospitality shown to each other and nobody owns the property. And so why, if we're left in this
that would
place,
be great to discuss, first of all. Can Occupy show hospitality, or is the police and the SWAT team always there to remind them that they're...
Yeah.
Always there.
How ironic.
I guess the question is, when we say what do we do with this thing now, why, to what degree do we have to be trapped by language for perpetuity, I guess is the question. Why can't we just shift that to say, hey, it's not tied to property structure. We have this space of mutual hospitality that's not tied to property, and we can leave this legacy of language behind.
Because we may be, we can't leave language. It has us on in a stranglehold. What we have to deal with is what Derrida has pointed out, because this is the question that you asked, and what we have to deal with is paleonymy. Does anyone know what that means?
Origin language and dinosaur.
Language as used.
Pre-word.
It's that we're stuck with old, skeletal, sclerotic words. We are stuck with them. We have words like and language is the house of being. We live in language. We are structured and destructured by language.
But don't we change the meaning of words through changes in behaviour over time?
We might, but it's still we're still tethered to, just as, this is a question. Let's put a question mark there and see. I think Lyotard would say you're too emancipatory. You think that we can climb out of the shithole that we're in, or we can find our way outside of the strictures and contractual implications that even have us talking to each other. That's why I started with our signing a prenup yesterday, right? Because to show you that as free as we think we are up here, of all places, not only are we in the sublime, under the sublime threat of a historical pressure zone, but now in a kind of, in another way, this is as much as we can do, which is struggle and wrestle and move, shift maybe meanings, but that doesn't, the more you think you can erase and repress, it's going to be coming bounding and bouncing back and bite your asses if you think you've gotten rid of a problem.
But doesn't this sort of palyonymy, doesn't it imply an essentialist view of the meaning of words?
No, I'm glad you asked. Now, Marcus,
well, I think it implies a really rigorous deconstructive reading of terms where you're aware of how complex the semantic sphere is. And what we're talking about, I think, raises the problem of like the unproblematized reversal. So to think that we could use the same word, have a different meaning, but in reality the metaphysical base is left untouched.
That's well stated. So paleonymic is basically in baby talk that we're stuck with old words. We're stuck. Man, woman, black, white, we're stuck there. We can struggle, and it may be a perpetual struggle, and we may have to wrestle many bad objects. But this is our predicament, and this is why things very often are disappointing and really suck, because we're still in a place where we're bound to language. And you're right, we want to shift meanings and all that, but if we do it by becoming oblivious to pernicious beginnings and assignments and appropriations, then we're just tricking ourselves, we're just faking it, and then it'll come back. This is one of the Freudian lessons and discoveries, that if you think you can do away with something and have a kind of erasure without remnant or trace or leftover or Überbleibsel or anything that just continues to grow out of this repressed thing, and you think you can erase it entirely, it will go, as we suggested yesterday already, into a state of latency. It will go underground only to explode in your face. So just erasing something or saying we have overcome. Now this is something that Lacoue-Labarthe pointed out. Do you all know who Lacoue-Labarthe is? He's a great philosopher. Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe, who worked with Jean-Luc Nancy. He said, and he was really very left of left, radical, and so on. He said that there's too much metaphysical Überwindung or overcoming. The dream of overcoming something, of doing away with stuff, or getting over it, which is a very American locution. I'm over it. I've moved on. But the struggle of Überwindung, or overcoming. We've overcome this, we've overcome that. He thought was very problematic and deluded. And this is what we tend toward. We think we've dealt with it. Been there, done that, dealt with it, moved on. I'm over it. The minute you hear someone insist on how over it they are, Yes, God.
There is, in terms of Überwindung, or overcome something, after 1945, and a period of decades of not touching the subject in Germany, the notion of Bewältigung.
Right.
And it's still going on. Haben wir das bewältigt?
Ja, genau.
Vergangenheitsbewältigung. Yeah? I don't know actually how to sell it.
Well,
to wrestle down is not really.
Well,
it's Überwältigung. Bewältigung
yeah,
is like.
first of all, have we mastered it? Have we dealt with it? Have we?
To master it. Actually.
To master
yeah.
it is the, but it has Gewalt in it
Yeah.
and kind of force it.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's very, so,
It's brutal
go
in
ahead.
a sense.
Yeah, we've overcome,
What's the
we've,
word in English?
what?
To master, but
That
in a more
doesn't get
brutal,
the
it doesn't get to the
Gewalt
point.
and
Bewältigen, like,
it's got
You have a sense of really struggling to put something down.
yeah, dominate.
To forget and dominate.
Perhaps
I've
appropriation.
mastered it, you know, I've mastered it, I've taken care of that problem. I think you have to go a little mafia to get the nuance of, you got rid of that problem, you know? We have a historical hitman on it, we never dealt with it, but we've mastered it. Absolutely. So in that case, too, what I'm saying is there is, not the first, there's Mr. Sigmund Freud, who said there will always be the problem in such cases of the return of the repressed. And the return has ballistic velocities. It'll really come at you. You know, if you think you've dealt with something. That's why, for Freud, working through is interminable, terminable. It's interminable. You've never dealt with it. You've never done enough. And as Derrida says in a somewhat similar way, you're never responsible enough. Anyone who thinks they've acted responsibly and they've dealt with something responsibly is not responsible. Because the nature of responsibility is excessive. If you think you gave $1 to a homeless person and you've been responsible, really? $1 to a homeless person? No. Responsibility is absolutely excessive. You have never been responsible enough. That's true responsibility, is to not be to think I haven't done enough. So this is a Dostoevsky thing that Levinas picks up from Dostoevsky, because Prince Mishkin, of course the idiot, says, you know, other people are responsible, but I'm more responsible. I'm responsible for everyone and everything. And that's hyper-responsibility that has no term or finite limit. So true responsibility means you're never done being responsible, and then we'll go this way, yeah.
I suppose responsibility is a bit of a red flag word for me at the moment, because I'm kind of interested in irresponsibility, simply because and pardon me for the kind of philistinism here, but in neoliberalism we have responsibilization. You can go on the Financial Times dictionary and
exactly.
business speak, and in responsibilization, the way that it disempowers people is actually very interesting, because power, not authority, but power, in fact definitely not authority, but power is apparently delegated to people. They are made responsible for their actions as human capital. And the problem with this is that they are given responsibility for their actions without any kind of framework of being able to make responsible decisions and be responsible.
This is what Derrida's actually going after, because this is conditional, this is the conservative appropriation of responsibility. Let's be responsible now. It's a limiting, very threatening position. So this is why Derrida goes after it, also to show that this isn't true responsibility. This is a mask and a pernicious ideological exploitation of, because you know that responsible, you're right, it sounds so conservative. Now let's be responsible, let's be sober and responsible. And it puts limits, and it allows for the worst exploitation and transgressions to occur. But this kind of an economic responsibility, that what he's talking about in terms of a hyper ethnicity or a hyper incalculable relation to the other, to alterity, to things, to history, to the debts we've incurred, is trying to go up against exactly what you were talking about. So yes, you're right. And by the way, in everything, in every utterance that we share, I always switch on the Nietzschean transvaluation machine, which is to say, I hear at least two registers of the same word. So absolutely, thank you. Responsibility has a really dark side of manipulation and capitalist degradation. And then there's a bit of a transvaluation with Derrida, Levinas, and even Dostoevsky in this instance, going with the other responsibility and the responsibility for the other. Yes, Alex.
With Dostoevsky, that's very interesting to me. Although I haven't read The Idiot, what I first think of is Crime and Punishment, right? Because you have two different sides of this apotropaic sort of masking of the dynamic sublime through responsibility, with Marmelado in the first part, where he's sort of, I'm responsible for everything, I sell my daughter into prostitution, it's all my fault, I'm a louse, pity me. And I don't think Derrida is going towards that sort of like infinite responsibility, right? He's not going towards like, let's all be kind of more like this drunk who is sort of like feigning his remorse about being such a drunk. On the other hand, you have the apotropaic
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Or will that impede your progress?
You can totally interrupt me.
Okay,
Yeah, totally.
great. Because I'll forget, but you won't. And I might have already. Okay. A response to part one of this outstanding intervention would be, of course not. Derrida would never show that some drunken idiot who takes all responsibility on himself and this narcissistic excess of it's all my fault, I did it, everything is my doing and my fault. Then I would have to show, right, no way. But it's both and. Because responsibility to be what it is has to be, as you will see with hospitality and now with forgiveness and undecidability, by the way, it's a moment of drunken madness. You can't take it on. So that's the double nature and the double edge of it. Because who can be so responsible as to be responsible? And so maybe you remember, maybe, he'll say it in forgiveness and we'll see it. But in undecidability, which you should be familiar with and intimate with, making a decision, Derrida says, is a moment of madness. If you didn't have to make a decision, then there's no decision to be made. Yeah, I prefer not to die, I prefer to have a nice room, I prefer to have better food. There's no decision, right? But undecidability means that when something you can't decide, yes but, no but, yes but, and you can't decide, it's just both are equally compelling, and you need to make a decision finally. The moment of jumping into the decision, like plunging into water off a cliff, the moment of decision in the face of undecidability is a moment of vertiginous madness. You just cut it. You just say, okay, I'm going to do this. I am going to go to those Alps, despite everything. And then there's a moment of dizziness, right? There's a moment of madness. You've made a decision. But it was undecidable. Now you will lose your property. Well, no. But anyway.
But in the case of Raskolnikov, which is the second apotropaic moment of dynamic sublime, where he breaks down at the crossroads and he confesses. And that, I think, is the ultimate sort of approach, not to necessarily this idea of responsibility, which is disappearing, but to the return of the same, which is like sort of this self-negotiation and this movement of a radical, dynamic, sublime of the self's relation to the other in the self, where you have this confession, this movement further into the world, and then it is a movement for Raskolnikov into the world, where he ends up in Siberia, you know, in this labor camp. But for him, it becomes this trip back to nature, and you know, Sonia joins him, and you know, he lives happily ever after, which is a ridiculous ending. But at the same time, that's kind of the.
But stay with the theme of responsibility that you were developing.
Okay, well, to say
you landed in Siberia suddenly.
It's well, he confesses,
right?
And in that sense, maybe he doesn't necessarily take or appropriate responsibility, but he understands it. He moves closer to it, and he lives his life almost in accordance, you know, as opposed to this idea of seizing responsibility, appropriating, or taking responsibility. He can sort of negotiate it and understand it.
We'll actually get to that with forgiveness, where things get confounded and the endless chain of substitution that we'll look at. So what was now end with a thesis statement.
My thesis is that
because I'm supposed to be your coach, your horse whisperer, your trainer, your animal trainer, your teacher, your friend, your enemy, your hostess with the mostest.
Hospitality in prison is what I would call this.